America is home to 33 million small businesses, the beating heart of communities across the country.
And proof that the American dream is still alive.
This is a show about those dreamers and doers and the communities they serve.
Their real life stories.
Their struggles and successes.
Their grit, determination, and passion.
And the people who fight
to keep their American dream alive.
I'm Alfredo Ortiz.
I'm Elaine Parker.
And it's time for another episode of Main Street Matters,
America's small business megaphone. Hi, and welcome to another episode of Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone. I'm Elaine Parker, the president of the Job Creators Network Foundation.
And I'm Alfredo Ortiz, CEO of Job Creators Network.
And you can subscribe to the show at salempodcastnetwork.com or wherever you get your podcasts from. So, Alfredo, today we're going to have Brandon Arnold, and he is with the National Taxpayers Union. And I'm excited to talk to him. I know we've talked to Grover Norquist at ATR in the past, but I'm excited to talk to him because they also are very supportive of the bill that just went through to extend the tax cuts, went through in the House and is over in the Senate now, sitting there eagerly awaiting the Senate approval. But I think it's a great opportunity for him to clear up some of the extreme misinformation on the tax bill, particularly with the child tax credit.
I'm excited to hear what Brandon has to say.
Brandon is the executive vice president of the National Taxpayers Union. In his role, he helps oversee strategic planning and government affairs efforts for NTU and its staff. Today, we'll talk about the Tax Relief for American Families and Workers Act and how it could help your family. Brandon, welcome to Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, tell us a little bit about the National Taxpayers Union and how you're helping American families and small businesses.
Yeah, our goal with National Taxpayers Union is to serve as the lobbyist of the taxpayer. Now, lobbyist can be a bad word in some circles, but essentially every single group that you can possibly imagine has some sort of lobbying presence in Washington. Even the lobbyists have a lobbying association representing their interests. But we realized there wasn't really an effective voice for lobbyists inside the halls of Congress. And that is what we try to provide, making sure that taxpayers are done well by Congress and certainly by the administration, in particular, the IRS.
And is your focus on just overall taxes, or you focus on business or different sectors, or just overall Americans?
We focus on Americans very broadly speaking. So that involves individual workers, families, businesses, and not just tax, I should say. It's fiscal policy because everything affects taxpayers. You think about spending, for instance. Spending has been absolutely out of control. We all know that. The national debt exceeding $34 trillion. All of these dollars that are spent, that are borrowed and spent by the Congress, are eventually going to materialize themselves in the form of tax cuts. Maybe not directly on us, but perhaps on our kids, on our grandchildren. So that fiscal management of the way we handle our national budget is critical for taxpayers, whether we're talking about spending, whether we're talking about taxes, or even when you get into the space of significant regulation, because we've seen a crushing blow delivered to the business community in particular, but to families as well by the federal government. And that also manifests itself in a fiscal manner. That means that when businesses can't operate because they are dealing with this red tape and regulatory ridiculousness, that means they're not creating jobs. They're not growing the economy. They're not contributing to our national economy. That is all a negative, and that's why we pay attention to the regulations facing the industry, the energy industry, healthcare industry, technology industry. You name it, we are paying attention to these things because they matter for taxpayers.
Yeah, that's great. Brandon, last week was a big week in the House. I know there was a big vote on the tax bill that I guess is making its way to the Senate. But can you walk kind of our viewers through what the bill actually addressed, especially the component of the tax? And there's a child tax credit as well, but really the part that impacts our small business owners and average Americans overall. If you could walk us through that.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a big victory, as you said, Alfredo. 357 members of Congress agreed on this piece of legislation, which is remarkable because I don't think 357 members of Congress agree on what day of the week it is. There's been such a ridiculous amount of partisanship, backbiting. It's been ridiculous on Capitol Hill, but it was great to see them come out, a show of force in support of this legislation. Republicans, Democrats, moderates, conservatives, you name it, supported this bill. And the reason is, I think, first of all, you talked about the child tax credit. There's so many families that are struggling now. I don't need to tell you or your listeners that. We see that every day. We've seen the force of inflation take its toll on small businesses, on family budgets, and so forth. So what this bill does is expand the child tax credit. That's a tax credit that literally tens of millions of Americans take advantage of, and it helps put food on the table. It helps offset the ridiculously high cost of raising a kid in today's economy. So that is going to, for everyday Americans, that's going to increase the child tax credit with inflation. So much of the tax code is indexed for inflation. Tax brackets, for instance, they increase every year to adjust for inflation. A lot of times we didn't really notice that when inflation was 2% or so. It was kind of a rounding error. But when you get into inflation in the 7, 8, 9% territory, all of a sudden those bracket increases help prevent people from getting big tax increases as they earned more money. So we increased a lot of the tax code, but we don't increase the child tax credit. And that was ridiculous. And that was something that was addressed in this piece of legislation. So the child tax credit for the duration of this bill, which is only 2 years, unfortunately, but for the duration of this bill, that will increase as inflation goes up. That is a really good provision. And you talk about the business.
Brandon, if I could interrupt for 2 seconds, because I know there's been a lot of kind of what I would call rumblings about whether this was a new tax credit or this was really just an extension and then kind of an increase versus something that was already in the Tax Act back under the Trump administration. If you could explain that as well, because I think there's definitely some misinformation when it comes to that.
Yeah, absolutely. The child tax credit was created in 1997. It was created as part of a Republican tax bill. It was a pro-growth tax bill and included this as a pro-family plank. And over the years, Republicans have really run point on the child tax credit. They expanded it 2 times under the George W. Bush administration. They expanded it, as you noted, during the Trump administration, the 2017 Big Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that doubled the size of the tax credit from $1,000 to $2,000. It also strengthened work requirements. It put in a Social Security number requirement for kids that were being claimed for this credit. And what this law does is preserve those improvements that have been made over the years. And then it includes a few other eligibility expansions. Essentially, it creates this look back, this 2-year look back period that allows parents to use the previous year's income in order to qualify for the tax credit, because there are work requirements that are built into this credit. You can't just claim it if you're not working. That was something Republicans fixed over the years. Democrats wanted to undo it, temporarily did undo that during the pandemic. And this strengthens that work requirement provision by essentially getting all Democrats on board supporting it, which I think is really important politically, because again, this provision is only going to last for 2 years. We're going to have a big fight over tax policy in 2025 when large portions of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act expires. And here we have Democrats on record saying, yeah, work requirements are good, and that's going to be a part of a child tax credit going forward.
Well, I think if my memory serves me correctly, even Clinton was a big proponent of the work requirement of folks who do receive help, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I think we go back into the welfare reforms of the early to mid 90s, having more work requirements there. Listen, there are a lot of people that can't work for a variety of reasons, but if you are an able-bodied American, then you should be out there working. And so I think this strengthens that notion here. I think it's a fundamentally American notion that people that can work should work. They shouldn't just live on the government's dime. So I think it was really important. Going into the negotiations over this tax package, we just actually had a meeting with Chairman Smith. Democrats wanted to obliterate the work requirements in their entirety. They wanted a much larger tax credit. They wanted to spend over $100 billion a year on an expansion of the child tax credit. We have a modest expansion here and one that preserves work requirements, at the same time recognizing the fact that inflation has taken a huge toll on the family budget right now and indexing this tax credit in order to account for that in portion. So I think there's a lot of strengthening that took place during these negotiations. Nobody got everything they wanted. That's the
Right.
process that we deal with in Congress. So there's plenty of nits to pick there. And we saw that take place on the House floor last week with some people decrying the immigration issue here or whatever. There really isn't an immigration issue. Social Security number requirement that was passed in 2017 under an entirely Republican Congress and under the leadership of then President Trump, preserved in their entirety here. No changes made to the immigration requirements.
Oh, that's great. Well, as you know, this was actually one of our 8 American Small Business Prosperity Plan. So we were actually excited to see the work really kind of being plussed up, so to speak, in this bill. Going back to the actual tax cuts that were really extended for small businesses, could you kind of walk us through that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's what we call cost recovery provisions in this, and these deal with interest deductibility, they deal with R&D expenses, and they also deal with capital expenditure. So people buying new factories, growing their plants, or so forth, making those big purchases. And when we talk about cost recovery, this is a really important part of tax policy, the ability to deduct fully and immediately investments that you make. So in the case of capital expenditures, if you're a pizza shop and you go out and you buy another pizza oven because you've seen a lot of demand, people are buying your product and you need to produce more, what you want to do is to be able to deduct that cost immediately on your tax bill. So you have that immediate benefit right there. Typically, if you don't have that, you have to amortize those costs. So you're going to be able to fully deduct it, but that might take 7, 10, 15 years in order to do so. Now, the time value of money is really important here because if I offered you $100, you would rather have that $100 in hand today rather than me give you $10 over the course of 10 years. The same principle is in play here. We want small business owners to be able to fully deduct these investments, to have that money in hand in order to pay their workers or enable to make further investments in their businesses, enable to innovate, do all those positive things that have helped our economy grow and develop.
When the Tax and Jobs Act did pass, this was an amazing benefit for them to be able to expand their businesses.
Yeah, I mean, we saw a huge boon coming out of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and I think this full expensing provision and the R&D expensing were really critical to it. Again, if you look at some of the pointy head economists out there, like our friends at the Tax Foundation, the expensing provisions, along with the corporate tax rate reductions, those were the 2 largest contributors to economic growth that came out of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. It's absolutely critical to put money in the hands of entrepreneurs, their own money, I should say. This isn't some sort of handout. I saw a few Republicans even say that this is a handout, that this is a tax credit. We're not talking about tax credits now. We're talking about the ability to deduct investments that you're making, whether those are in R&D, so we're innovating, we're creating new pharmaceutical products, we're developing new software, new technologies, all those things in order to make those investments and then get credit on your taxes immediately, rather than, again, having to amortize those over the course of, could be a decade, could be even longer in some instances.
Well, and I think, Brandon, especially on the manufacturing side, huge benefit. I mean, as you know very well, last year the job growth really didn't happen as much in the manufacturing side, and we know we need manufacturing jobs in this country. So I think this is really going to help push that forward. So now it's moving its way to the Senate. Is that correct?
Yeah, it passed the House, like I said, 357 votes, which is fantastic. Moves to the Senate. There are some hurdles there. So there are some roadblocks there. I think part of the issue is just the procedural problems. When you go to the Senate, everything moves slower in the Senate. They also have a big immigration bill, a border bill that they're dealing with right now that's going to suck a lot of time out of the Senate schedule. And then there's also some problems there. I think there are some members of the Senate, they just want to kind of put their stamp on this legislation. They don't want to just automatically check the box and send it to the president's desk. They want to have an opportunity to amend it, put their own modifications and so forth onto the legislation. I think there's certainly room for improvement here. There's always room for improvement on legislation, but we have a really strong bill, and the quickest way to deliver relief is to just to send this to the president's desk. And that's what I hope they'll do, especially when you're talking about tax changes that are made during tax season. A lot of people are just starting that process of filing their taxes here. The quicker we can get this done and on the books, the easier a process it'll be for the IRS, let alone all of the individual and business tax filers out there.
Yep. So this is retroactive.
It is. Not all of it, but the business provisions are all retroactive. The child tax credit, some of the parts of the child tax credit will be retroactive to the beginning of this year, and some of them, like the indexing, will take effect. While they take effect this year, people won't really appreciate that until they reconcile their taxes in early 2025.
Gotcha. Elaine?
Brandon, we were big supporters of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. We had a national campaign. We did a bus tour around the country, meeting with small business owners and members of Congress. And just to give you some like real examples of our small business owners and what they did with the tax cuts, we have a manufacturer in Pennsylvania. And while he loved the 20% tax deduction for his pass-through manufacturing company, because in Pennsylvania, when he added all his taxes together, he was up paying about 50% at the individual rate because he has an S Corp pass-through organization. He said, that's great. You know, obviously I love bringing my tax rate down. He said, but the immediate expensing was an absolute game changer. And he was able to expand his, he has a manufacturing facility. He doubled the size of it. He hired about 30 more people. He increased wages. He gave employees bonuses that first year too. And for the first time since he had started his company in well over a decade at that time, he was able to offer a retirement plan, a 401k to his employees to create longevity, careers, and keep people in their town. He's in kind of a small town, a more rural town in Pennsylvania. He's a big employer, though, for a small town. He's got about 150 employees. Those are the kinds of stories that I think members of Congress, no matter what side of the aisle they're on, should hear, because he said, we can't afford to lose our youth. They were growing up, they were going away for school, and they weren't coming back because there wasn't a job base there. And he said, I'm trying to create a job base and keep our town, you know, growing. And those are the kinds of stories that we really need to get out there. So it's something that we really try to do on a continuous basis, is get those stories out and amplify those stories.
Yeah, that's an amazingly powerful story. And let me just back up here to how you started your anecdote there. In 2017, I remember what a huge impact Job Creators Network had on the conversation over the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. You guys were just a tour de force on that. So thank you for your work in getting what was the most consequential tax package of my professional life across the finish line. You guys were amazing. But moving forward, yeah, I mean, so many people are framing this as a corporate provision, and that's just completely erroneous. We've seen so many small businesses take advantage of these full expensing provisions. I was just talking to somebody this morning about small businesses, startup companies that are innovating new software products, and they are extremely thin when it comes to liquidity. They don't have a lot of money to deal with. So being able to pay their employees, you know, it's so much of that is dependent on being able to expense their R&D expenditures. And they've operated all this time under the hope and prayer that Congress would renew this provision because there was bipartisan support. But guess what? We're at the 11th hour, and a lot of these businesses are having to leverage debt in order to pay their employees, to pay just to stay afloat as a company. We're not even talking about expanding at this point. We're just talking about being in survival mode. We've seen what's happened with interest rates. So all of that money they've borrowed is at a much higher rate than it would have been a few years ago. So this is critical. This is critical for small businesses, not just corporations. It's critical for the small business community. And like you said, for the communities, the neighborhoods, the small towns and so forth that are so dependent on these businesses for jobs and for the livelihood of those around them.
So I'm going to ask you to put on your crystal ball, take out your crystal ball and do a little bit of predicting for us. First, do you see this getting through the Senate and signed by the president? And second, looking more long term, because all of the provisions are going to expire in 2025. How do you see the presidential election affecting this, as well as the future Congress coming in? Obviously, we have a slim majority. Republicans have a slim majority in the House. The Democrats have the Senate right now. I mean, could we really see them allow this to sunset as they, duke it out, and as they always do, along partisan lines?
Yeah, that's going to be a tough one to answer with any kind of confidence, but I do think the easy part is I do think this package is going to make it to the president's desk. It might be modified slightly. It might take a few weeks to get there because, like I said, the Senate is working on this border package this week. They're going on recess next week, a 2-week recess. So I don't know exactly when the Senate is going to take it up, but I do think they have the votes there. I think they have more than 60 votes to support this package, get it to the president's desk. And Biden has already said that he will sign this. So I think this is a matter of time. Fingers crossed, knock on wood, whatever we have to do. But I do feel fairly confident about that. And then, looking so much of what the future of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is and the future of this child tax credit expansion, of course, will depend on November. And I'm not putting a nickel on any of the races in November
Right.
here because I think so much can happen between now and then. The good news is that if we do end up with, say, a President Biden, he has said he at least wants to preserve some parts of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And if we end up with a President Trump, he'll be full in on supporting the entirety of it. And if we end up with somebody else, I have no idea. But I think there's so much uncertainty heading into this election. I haven't even talked about Congress. But the fact is, at the end of 2025, huge portions of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act go away. We keep the tax reductions at the corporate level, the corporate rate at least. We talked about the small business, the pass-through deduction, that is gone. All the individual rates, those are gone. This child tax credit went from $1,000 up to $2,000. That's gone. The doubling of the standard deduction, just huge impacts here on our economy, on small businesses, on everyday Americans. I don't think even a Democratic Congress and a Democratic president will let all of that come to fruition. But we'll see. We'll see. It's going to be interesting for sure.
So Brandon, if we could just shift a little bit, because I'd love to hear your thoughts on debt, especially our debt. So a lot of the conversation, naysayers on the particular packages, that it's just going to hurt us even further. It's just going to add to the debt, over $34 trillion, as you know. What are your thoughts on these kinds of tax cuts and impact to our debt?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, in 2017, people kind of cared about the debt, but not a lot. And, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act added, at that time, the projections were about $1.5 trillion to the debt. And people were like, that's fine. It's kind of a rounding error. I think the conversation has changed quite a bit in the intervening years. And now we're seeing a lot more people attuned to the impacts of debt. A lot of that came from inflation, because we spent so much money, trillions and trillions of dollars during the pandemic, that absolutely boosted inflation far higher than it otherwise would have been. All of a sudden, people are saying, maybe we need to tap the brakes when it comes to these enormous deficits. Maybe we need to be a little bit more fiscally responsible. And that was one of the few silver linings, I think, that came out of the pandemic. People a little bit more attuned to our fiscal management or mismanagement, if you will. So this package here that we're talking about that just passed last week, it actually is deficit neutral effectively. It eliminates the employee retention tax credit that was created during the pandemic, uses its elimination to pay for the $80 billion package. And I think that's really smart and really appropriate. And I think that ought to be the mentality going forward. Whether we're eliminating special interest tax credits, I think, we spent over $1 trillion on special interest tax credits with the Inflation Reduction Act, the worst named piece of legislation in our nation's history, on electric vehicles, on all sorts of renewable energy build out. I'm fine with renewable energy, but I don't think we need to subsidize it to the extent that we're doing here. I think that's ridiculous. So there's a lot of opportunities to scale back some of the largesse that we've seen the past few years with the pandemic, and honestly, with a Democratic president that has spent far more than we ought to have, reining in some of that spending, pulling back on some of these special interest tax credits, replacing them with more broad-based relief that's going to benefit average families, normal businesses, regardless of what type of industry they're in, instead of just picking and choosing our favorite industries and saying, we're going to give you tax credits, but we're not going to provide that same kind of relief to other businesses.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, constitutional budget amendments, balanced budget amendments. So that's something that we're pushing for. We're supportive of. And I apologize, I didn't research this piece prior to today. But where do you guys stand on something like that?
We've been supportive of a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution literally for decades. We're over 50 years old as an organization, and I wasn't around for those early years, as you might gather. But from our inception, essentially, we've been supportive of a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution, and we will continue to be. It's a really high hurdle to clear when you're talking about amending the Constitution.
Yeah.
Part of the 2011 budget deal. And I was around for that. Part of the 2011 budget deal was it required, this is the Budget Control Act. It created budget caps, which was great. And it also required Congress to vote on a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. Also great. But when we started actually putting together a balanced budget amendment, that's when the wheels started coming off, because there was so much disagreement about the minutia of how a balanced budget amendment should function. Providing flexibility, for instance, in the case of war or natural disaster or so forth. Like, how do we account for those things? That support for the balanced budget just kind of fell apart, and we didn't end up having nearly as strong a vote as we would have liked. So that's one of the things I think we need to think about. Absolutely need a balanced budget amendment, but a lot of times the devil's in the details, and crafting one that does have enough flexibility, that it's functional in a time where, we could go to war, when we could have hurricanes or tornadoes or so forth that require Congress to spend more than they otherwise might have done so. So, yes, let's create a balanced budget amendment. Yes, let's work on the details and let's get it right, because it's really important. In the interim, I think we can do things like a fiscal commission. That's something we've been very, very supportive of. There's been bipartisan support for doing that. And hopefully that's something we can get across the finish line as well. It still needs to pass both the House and the Senate, but it did clear the House Budget Committee in a bipartisan vote just a couple weeks ago.
What's in for any of those efforts, Brandon? Because this is something that we truly believe that we really just have to stop talking about it and actually get it done.
Yeah, I agree. And one of the problems we have here in Washington, there's so many folks that want to make the perfect the enemy of the good. Congress, unfortunately, it's 435 members in the House, 100 members in the Senate. You're never going to get your way entirely. People have to recognize that if you get 75%, 60% of what you want, then that's usually good enough to move forward. And I think that's the case with the fiscal commission. Let's put everything on the table, recognizing the fact that you're putting stuff that you like on the table. Yes, we don't want to see tax increases. No, we don't want to see cuts to certain departments made. But if we want to have a fulsome, honest conversation about our national debt, about the future of our country from a fiscal perspective, we need to put everything on the table, and we need to go through what might be an uncomfortable exercise for some in going over every dollar that is spent and every tax credit and other revenue-oriented provision as well, even if there's, again, some stuff we may not like that's on the table.
Yeah, excellent. Elaine?
Yeah, Brandon, I think the trouble is sometimes the Congress approaches cuts in spending as just a cut in the amount of increase. And, unfortunately, Americans don't really ever see the cuts, or there's all the budgetary gimmicks that they use through the CBO to try to show, over 10 years, it's going to do this, that, or the other, when we all know that a new Congress is going to come in and change that and spend more. And I think that's why the American people just kind of get fed up in that area. So we definitely would love to see budgetary constitutional amendment and real spending, responsible spending cuts, obviously. But it just seems like whenever there's any discussion of any kind of real cuts, it's an impossible conversation, and it never actually happens on either side.
Yeah, very, very true, and very, very frustrating. We've seen so many cuts that are, when they're scheduled to take place, all of a sudden there'll be this bipartisan agreement, and they both agree. Republicans are like, well, let's plus up, instead of cutting, let's plus up defense spending. Right. And Democrats will say, sure, in agreement for that, we want a plus up to domestic spending for healthcare or whatever the issue is of the moment. So yeah, they agree that they disagree on what we should increase spending on, but they agree that spending ought to go up, and therefore taxpayers lose out. That's why we need to be so vigilant about what's taking place in Congress. They rely on gimmicks. They rely on all sorts of sleight of hand in order to say they're being fiscally responsible, when in reality, we've seen more and more red ink, and we just can't tolerate it anymore. That's why I really support these institutional restraints that are bigger than just an individual Congress, whether it's a fiscal commission or, better yet, like you're advocating for, a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution, which is really, really hard to skirt.
Well, how can everybody learn more about National Taxpayers Union and what your team is doing? Obviously, we love your perspective, and we obviously there's a lot of crossover in the areas that we all support.
Yeah, I think a lot of overlap there, and we really enjoy working with you guys. You're a fantastic partner. National Taxpayers Union, we're obviously on the web, ntu.org. We're on all the socials, YouTube, X, I guess it's called now, Facebook. You can find us all over the place. We appreciate your engagement, checking out our videos, reading our articles, our papers, and so forth. Whatever you can do, we really appreciate it.
Well, Brandon, thanks so much for taking the time to join us on Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone. Main Street Matters is part of the Salem Podcast Network. New episodes debut every Wednesday and Friday. You can subscribe to the show at Salem Podcast Network or wherever you get your podcast from. And I hope you can come back soon.